The pages which follow are an abbreviation specially authorized by me for Messrs. Scribner of my large work on Carthage and the Carthaginians. I have made no attempt to alter the Such, very briefly, was the city, and such the race whose varied fortunes, so far as our fragmentary materials allow us, we are about to trace. What were the causes of the rapid rise of Carthage? What was the extent of her African and her foreign dominions, and the nature of her hold upon them? What were the peculiar excellences and defects of her internal constitution, and what the principles on which she traded and colonized, conquered and ruled? To these and other questions some answer must be given as a necessary preliminary to that part of her history which alone we can trace consecutively. Some answer we must give, but how are we to give it? No native poet whose writings have come down to us has sung of the origin of Carthage or of her romantic voyages. No native orator has described in glowing periods, which we can still read, the splendor of her buildings and the opulence of her merchant princes. No native annalist has preserved the story of her long rivalry with Greeks and Etruscans, and no African philosopher has moralized upon the stability of her institutions or the causes of her fall. All have perished. The text of 3 treaties with Rome, made in the days of her prosperity, the log book of an adventurous Carthaginian admiral dedicated on his return from the Senegal or the Niger as a votive offering in the temple of Baal. Some fragments of the practical precepts of a Carthaginian agriculturist, translated by the order of the utilitarian Roman Senate, a speech or two of a vagabond Carthaginian, in the Penulus of Plautus, which has been grievously mutilated in the process of transcribing it into Roman letters, a few Punic inscriptions buried 20 feet below the surface of the ground, entombed and preserved by successive Roman and Vandal and Arab devastations, and now at length revealed and deciphered by the efforts of French and English archaeologists, the massive substructions of ancient temples, the massive substructions of ancient temples, the enormous reservoirs of water, and the majestic procession of stately aqueducts which no barbarism has been able to destroy. These are the only native or semi-native sources from which we can draw the outlines of our picture, and we must eke out our narrative of Carthage in the days of her prosperity as best we may from a few chapters of reflections by the greatest of the Greek philosophers, from the late Roman annalists who saw everything with Roman eyes, and from a few but precious antiquarian remarks in the narrative of the great Greek historian Polybius, who, with all his love of truth and love of justice, saw Carthage only at the moment of her fall, and was the bosom friend of her destroyer. In her origin, at least, Carthage seems to have been like other Phoenician settlements, a mere commercial factory. Her inhabitants cultivated friendly relations with the natives, looked upon themselves as tenants at will rather than as owners of the soil, and as such cheerfully paid a rent to the African Berbers for the ground covered by their dwellings. It was the instinct of self-preservation alone which dictated a change of policy and transformed this peace-loving mercantile community into the warlike and conquering state of which the whole of the Western Mediterranean was so. Soon to feel the power The result of this change of policy was that the western half of the Mediterranean became what at one time the whole of it had bidden fair to be, a Phoenician lake in which no foreign merchantmen dared to show themselves. It was a vast preserve to be caught trespassing, upon which, so Strabo tells us, on the authority of Eratosthenes, ensured the punishment of instant death by drowning. No promontory was so barren, no islet so insignificant, as to escape the jealous and ever watchful eye of the Carthaginians. In Corsica, if they could not get any firm or extensive foothold themselves, they at least prevented any other state from doing the like. Into their hands fell, in spite of the ambitious dreams of Persian kings and the aspirations of patriot Greeks, that greatest of all islands, the island of Sardinia. Theirs were the Aegaean and the Liparaean, the Balearic and the Pityusian Isles. There's the tiny Elba, with its inexhaustible supply of metals. There's too Malta. Still remained an outpost pushed far into the domain of their advancing enemies. A memorial of what once had been, and perhaps to the sanguine Carthaginian temperament, an earnest of what might be again hereafter. Above all, the Phoenician settlements in Spain, at the innermost corner of the great preserve, with the adjacent silver mines, which gave to these settlements their peculiar value, were now trebly safe from all intruders. Elated, as it would seem, by their naval successes, which were hardly of their own seeking, the Carthaginians thought that they might now at last become the owners of the small strip of African territory which they had hitherto seemed to occupy, on sufferance only, and they refused the ground rent which up till now they had paid to the adjoining tribes. Step by step they enlarged their territories at the expense of the natives, till the whole of the rich territory watered by the bragadas became theirs. The nomadic tribes were beaten back beyond the river Triton into the country named, from the roving habits of its inhabitants, Numidia, or into the desert of Tripolis. The agricultural tribes were forced to pay tribute to the conquerors for the right of cultivating their own soil, or to shed their blood on the field of battle in the prosecution of further conquests from the tribes beyond. Nor did the kindred Phoenician settlements in the adjoining parts of Africa escape unscathed. Utica alone, owing probably to her antiquity and to the semi-parental relation in which she stood to Carthage, was allowed to retain her walls and full equality of rights with the rising power, but Hippo, Saritus, and Adrumetum, the greater and the lesser Leptis, were compelled to pull down their walls and acknowledge the supremacy of the Carthaginian city. All along the northern coast of Africa, the original Phoenician settlers, and probably to some extent the Carthaginians themselves, had intermarried with the natives. The product of these marriages was that numerous class of Libby Phoenicians, which proved to be so important in the history of Carthaginian colonization and conquest, a class which, equidistant from the Berbers on the one hand and from the Carthaginians proper on the other, and composed of those who were neither wholly citizens nor yet wholly aliens, experienced the lot of most half-castes, and were alternately trusted and feared, pampered and oppressed, loved and hated by the ruling state. One enterprise which was undertaken by the Carthaginians in obedience to the fiat of the king of Persia, to the lasting good of humanity, failed of its object. Xerxes, BC 480, advancing with his millions of barbarians upon Athens from the east, bade, so it is said, Hamilcar advance his 300,000 mercenaries upon Syracuse from the west. The torch of Greek learning and civilization was to be extinguished at the most opposite ends of the Greek world at one and the same moment, but, happily for mankind at large, both attempts were foiled. The efforts of Xerxes ended in the destruction of the Persian fleet at Salamis, and the disgraceful flight of the king to Asia. The efforts of Hamilcar ended in his defeat at death at Himera. And in the destruction of 150,000 of his army, and by a dramatic propriety which is not common in history, whatever it may be in fiction, this double victory of Greek civilization is said to have taken place in the same year and on the very same day. Let us now turn to the political organization of the city, which achieved so rapid and marvelous a development, and inquire how far it was the effect and how far the cause of her prosperity. The constitution of Carthage was not the work of a single legislator, as that of Sparta is said to have been, nor of a series of legislators like that of Athens. It was rather like that of England, the growth of circumstances and of centuries. It obtained the praise of Aristotle for its judicious admixture of the monarchical, the oligarchical, and the democratical elements. The original monarchical constitution, doubtless inherited from Tyre, was represented by two supreme magistrates called by the Romans suffets. Their name is the same as the Hebrew shofetim, mistranslated in our Bible, judges. The Hamilcars and Hannos of Carthage were, like their prototypes, the Gideons and the Samsons of the book of Judges. Not so much the judges as the protectors and the rulers of their respective states. They are compared by Greek writers to the two kings of Sparta and by the Romans to their own consuls. Beneath these kings came in the older constitution a council called by the Greeks the Gerousia, or Council of Ancients, consisting of 28 members, over which the suffets presided. This council declared war, ordered levies of troops, appointed generals, sent out colonies. If the council and suffets agreed, their decision was final. If they disagreed, the matter was referred to the people at large. In this and in other ways, each element of the body politic had its share in the administration of the state. But the Carthaginian constitution described and praised by Aristotle is not the same as that of the Punic Wars. In the interval which separates the two epochs, short as it is, a great change which must have been long preparing had been completed. The suffets had gradually become little more than an honorary magistracy. The Senate over which they presided had allowed the main part of their power to slip out of their hands into those of another body called the Judges, or the 100, which, if it seemed to be more liberal in point of numbers and in conformation, was much more exclusive in policy and in spirit. The appeal to the people was only now restored to in times of public excitement, when the rulers, by appearing to share power, tried to lessen envy and allowed the citizens to go through the form of registering what, practically, they had already decreed. The result was an oligarchy like that of Venice, clear-sighted and consistent, moderate, nay, often wise in its policy, but narrow in its views, and often suspicious alike of its opponents and of its friends. By the old constitution, the Senate had the right to control the magistrates, but this new body of judges controlled the Senate, and therefore, in reality, the magistrates also. Nor was it content to control the Senate. It practically superseded it. Its members did not, as a rule, appropriate the offices of state to themselves, but they could summon their holders before them and so draw their teeth. No shofet, no senator, no general was exempt from their irresponsible despotism. The shofets presided, the senators deliberated, the generals fought, as it were, with a halter round their necks. The sentences passed by the 100, if they were often deserved, were often also like those of the dreaded 10 at Venice, to whom they bore a striking resemblance, arbitrary and cruel. The unsuccessful general, whether his ill success was the result of uncontrollable circumstances or of culpable neglect, might be condemned to crucifixion. Indeed, he often wisely anticipated his sentence by committing suicide. Within the ranks of this close oligarchy, first-rate ability would seem to have been at a discount. Indeed, the exact equality of all within the privileged ranks is as much a principle of oligarchy as is the equal suppression of all that is outside of it. Language bears testimony to this in the name given alike to the homoioi of Sparta and the peers of England. It was jealousy, for instance, of the superior abilities of the family of Mago and their prolonged preeminence in the Carthaginian state, which had in the 5th century BC cemented the alliance between other and less able families of the aristocracy, and so had first given rise to this very institution of the 100 judges. And it was the same mean jealousy of all that is above itself, which afterwards, in the time of the Punic Wars, united as one man a large part of the ruling oligarchs in the vain efforts to control and to thwart and to annoy with 1,000 petty annoyances the one family of consummate ability which Carthage then possessed, the noble-minded Barcinagens, that lion's brood, who were brought to the front in those troublous times by the sheer force of their genius, and who, for 3 generations, ruled by the best of all rights, the right divine, that of unswerving devotion to their country, of the ability to rule, and the will to use that ability well. If we try, as we cannot help trying, to picture to ourselves the daily life and personal characteristics of the people whose political organization we have just described, and to ask not what the Carthaginians did, for that we know, but what they were, we are confronted by the provoking blank in the national history which has already been noticed. Such few indications as we have are in thorough keeping with the view we have taken of the political exclusiveness of the ruling clique. There were public baths, but since no member of the Senate would bathe where the people bathe, a special class of baths were set apart for their use. There were public messes, as they were called, but these were not, as Aristotle supposed, analogous to the Spartan syssitia, an institution intended to foster manliness and simplicity of life. The black broth of the heroes of Sparta would not have suited the Carthaginian nobles who, clad in their famous cloth, dyed twice over with the purple dye of their African, their Spanish, or their Tyrian fisheries, and decorated with the finely cut glass beads, the invention of their Phoenician forefathers, fare sumptuously on their abounding flocks and herds, or on such delicious fruits as those with which Cato moved the astonishment and the envy of the senators of Rome. The Carthaginian syssitia were incentives to luxury, not checks upon it. They were clubs formed originally for social gatherings and afterwards applied to the purpose of political gossip or corruption. Dining tables of the costly citron wood, a single specimen of which Pliny tells us in the time of the Roman Empire cost as much as a broad estate, must have been common amongst those who monopolized the commerce of the countries where alone the citron tree grows. Gold and silver plate cannot have been rare amongst those who controlled the rich mines of Spain, and to whom their ambassadors reported with a touch of scorn upon their return from Rome that they had been hospitably entertained by senator after senator, but that one service of plate had done duty for all. Objects of fine art, statues and paintings and embroideries, there were in abundance at Carthage, but they were the work of Greek, not of Phoenician artists, and their abundance indicated not so much the genius, critical or creative, of the Carthaginian community as the number of Greek towns, Selinus and Himera, Gela and Agrigentum, sacked in the Sicilian Wars. Carthage was beyond doubt the richest city of antiquity. Her ships were to be found on all known seas, and there was probably no important product, animal, vegetable, or mineral of the ancient world which did not find its way into her harbors and pass through the hands of her citizens.